Terrific. Oh, perfect. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 7-Eleven committee meeting here on October 20th. We have a jam-packed agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As you see here on our agenda, as we get started with our opening procedures, we're going to start tonight with roll call. So I'll go ahead and call the names. Miss Diana Perry's, Mr. Don Gosney.
Here.
Miss Doreen Chand. Mr. James Sanders.
Here.
Miss Javonta Wagley. Miss Samantha Ann Torres.
Here.
Miss Summer Sigler.
Here.
And Mr. Trey Holland.
Here.
Terrific. Thank you, everyone. We do have a quorum. And so now we'll ask for the approval of the agenda.
So moved. Don Gosney.
And do we have a second?
I'll second it. James Sanders.
Should we go ahead and do a roll call vote? Don Gosney,
Yes.
Mr. Sanders,
Yes.
Ms. Torres,
Yes.
Ms. Sigler,
Yes.
Mr. Holland.
Yes.
Terrific. So moving down our agenda, we do have approval of meeting minutes. So we do have draft meeting minutes included in the packet for both the July 28th and the September 13th meeting. Do I have a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
So moved.
So moved by Mr. Gosney. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Ms. Sigler. And now for the roll call vote, Mr. Gosney,
Yes.
Mr. Sanders,
Yes.
Ms. Torres,
Yes.
Ms. Sigler, maybe we'll come right back to her, Mr. Holland,
Yes.
Ms. Sigler. Are you there?
Yes.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So we did do calls and wanted to see what availability would be for an upcoming meeting on November 3rd and potentially November 17th. We will continue to reach out to committee members to make sure that in confirming our next meeting date that we'll be able to have a quorum, but we are looking at those as next meeting dates for the 7-Eleven committee. So moving on for public comment, do we have any public comment this evening? And it looks like we do have a hand raised. Miss Joanna Pace.
Hi there. My name is Joanna Pace, and I am a community member who lives in El Cerrito and attends church in East Richmond Heights. I listened to the recording of the first meeting, I believe it was, and I want to correct a mistaken statement in that first meeting where your consultant described the property around Adams. He described Adams as being on the other side of the road from a private school. In fact, it is across the street on Patterson Circle from a church that rents to a private school. Open Door United Methodist Church has been at that address 6226 Arlington Boulevard for over 50 years. And we've had the same tenant, Crestmont School, for close to 50 years. So we want the school district to understand that that its neighbor is a church, not that rents to a school. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other public comment this evening?
So it's not in the form of a public comment, but Andrew Green has put a question in the question answers of a few questions regarding Adams. Would Mr. Green like to voice those questions?
Mr. Geen, could you try to unmute?
Hi, can you hear me?
Good evening. Hear you.
Perfect. I've just got a few questions really about the Adams site as well. I haven't gone back to look at the previous meeting, and that perhaps is where I should start. But I've just been looking at the slideshow, which I downloaded from, I guess, the website. It suggests the comps are between $25 and $35 per square foot. And I'm curious as to who did the comps. And can you share what information goes into actually coming out with that figure? That seems like that's severely undervalued unless that takes into account demolition costs as well. Also, I'm curious as to the valuation of it. Obviously, as a community member, I mean, I live right next door too. If we're going to sell this to private ownership, then I'm also a teacher, so we want to get West Contra Costa to get as much money as possible. And when I go to your slideshow, it says approximation is 6.5 to 9.1 million. Now, I'm curious as to how we come up with that figure. If the plan is to put 36 new homes on there, those homes are going to be $1 million each. So for someone to buy. So I'm curious, there seems to be, whether that's my lack of understanding, but there seems to be a shortfall here of a considerable amount of money, and obviously understanding that any contractor is going to have to make a fair grip on this. But
Melissa, I don't see Scott, but if you'd like me to respond, I can, if it's appropriate.
So we typically don't respond to public comment, but I think we can address all of those questions in the presentation a little bit later in the meeting, and keep these questions in mind so that we're sure to make sure that we're addressing the questions that were asked.
That's fine.
thanks.
Thank you so much. So I don't see any other public comment at this time. So that's going to go ahead and lead us to our first discussion item tonight. And tonight we have with us Miss Nancy Taylor from Orbach, Huff and Henderson, and she's here tonight to really provide an educational piece to the committee. We heard at the previous meetings, it's really a desire to understand kind of what are the four corners of public property, what makes a property surplus, and what does the disposition process look like, and really so that we could ensure that the committee really understands all of the options that are available. And so she's here tonight to really share with the committee the educational side of all things property. And so with that, we're going to turn it over to her. And Ms. Taylor, is it okay if I just do your slides for you? Is that?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Give me just 1 second to get set up. There we go. Okay, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Perfect. Good evening. So tonight I'm going to review the potential disposition options for the 4 sites that this committee is reviewing. In order for you to have as much information as possible so that this committee can determine the best use of this property, my presentation will include information related to all the available options under the education code. And it's not going to be limited to options that may be best for these particular properties. For this reason, any questions regarding whether a particular option is suitable for these properties should be directed to Terra Realty when they review the properties and options later tonight. But I do believe for this committee to have the full information of all potential disposition, that we do need to go over briefly all of the allowable disposition options under the Ed Code. We previously discussed that the ultimate goal of this committee is to facilitate the district's governing board making the best possible decision regarding the use of its excess property. This is accomplished by the process that you're currently undertaking, and will conclude with the committee forwarding a report to the district's governing board, which should include a determination of the highest and best use of the property based in part on the information that's being provided to the committee members by the district and its consultants. The report should also list acceptable uses. This should be an all-inclusive list so that it's not too restrictive. And the reason why we say that is because, as we're going to discuss tonight, while you issue the report, that doesn't mean the next day the district is selling or leasing the property. What that does is it really sets in process a series of events and obligations under the education code that will take time. And with time and trying to get rid of property, we have market influences that could make what was at one time the highest and best use no longer the highest and best use, and or sometimes what we say is an acceptable use just doesn't work out. So for this reason, the report should include a list of acceptable uses and not just constrain it to just one use. And then some optional things that you may be presented and that may be included in that report will be information based on appraisals and information obtained from the title report that will affect the valuation of those properties, which can include restrictions on use and any reversionary clauses that affect the disposition itself. And the goal of that report is to educate the board on the committee's work. Following recommendations from the committee, the board will adopt a resolution regarding the intended disposition of that property, if any. And the board's recommendation will take into consideration the report that you are preparing. In the report, the recommendations will say whether or not this committee has determined that the property is surplus. And that just means that the property is excess property that the district doesn't need for its own educational purposes. So we're first going to review the options for property should this committee determine that these properties or any one or two of these properties are surplus. Again, I think one of the common misconceptions is that once you declare it surplus, then you can slap up a for sale sign. That isn't the case. It actually sets forth a series of public offerings and notices that must be accomplished in order to ultimately sell, lease, or otherwise dispose of this property. And that includes public offerings and notices, optional offerings to child care development agencies. If there's any vacant classroom space, there's offerings to the County Office of Education and SELPA. And then depending on the property, it could be subject to the Naylor Act. So with respect to the notice to public local planning agencies, the district has to provide notice to the local planning commission of its intent to sell or lease the property. The planning commission then has 40 days to report on the district's intention. Once that's accomplished, the district can then make its priority offerings, which, as you see here, they can offer the property for sale or lease to a list of public agencies and entities, and those include the Director of General Services, the UC Regents, the CSU, the city in which the property is located, the county in which the property is located, and public housing authorities. Also, in a more general nature, the district has to publish a public notice that gets run in the newspaper of general circulation once a week for 3 successive weeks. That just basically notifies any public district, public authority, public agency, public corporation, or other political subdivision that the district has property that it's intending to get rid of. So once those public entities and agencies are provided that notice, they have 60 days from that third publication to notify the district of its intent to purchase or lease the property. If any of those public agencies decide that they want to offer to purchase or sale, then they have to negotiate that with the district. If the district is unable to successfully negotiate a purchase or sale with one of those public agencies, then the district can proceed to public bidding. Additionally, if, for example, the district were to receive more than one offer from any of those public agencies that are entitled to a priority offering, then the district has discretion to negotiate with whatever public agency they would like. Did someone have a question?
This is Don. I did have a question. What is SELPA?
Oh, so SELPA is the Special Education Local Area Plan. All school districts and county offices are mandated to have within their geographical region a consortium to provide special education services to the children that reside within their boundaries.
Thank you.
May I ask a question, please?
Mhm.
As I understand the difference between the 7-Eleven committee process and the process that you just outlined, the 7-Eleven committee process permits the district to go outside the normal progression of events in terms of public agencies. Is that correct?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, it is not. The 7-Eleven committee is a prerequisite for this process that I'm going through right now. So the district the district only has 2 or 3 options to avoid convening the 7-Eleven committee. But it has to, outside of those two or 3 exceptions, the district has to convene the 7-Eleven process first for this committee to determine whether or not in the first instance it's surplus. And then if it is, make recommendations to the board regarding the disposition.
Okay.
Before it can then dispose of it, how this committee determines is the highest and best use, it has to make all of these priority offerings. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Perfect. Okay. That's why I was saying it's not like we can go out and slap up a for sale sign tomorrow. We still have a lot of people that we have to offer this to, and it is time consuming.
Well,
Yeah.
you may be aware that there was an attempt some years back to sell the Adams site for the equivalent of a price of a pickup truck, if you will. And it didn't happen, but it was attempted.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so if it's vacant classroom that the district intends to lease, then the district also has to pass a resolution of intent, and that it intends to lease the vacant classroom and then offer it to the County Office of Education and the SELPA. And then those entities have 60 days to respond to the district's office. Also, certain property is subject to the Naylor Act. So the legislature is concerned that playgrounds, playfields, and recreational property will be lost for those uses by the surrounding community when property that's been used for these purposes for many years is sold. Therefore, the intent of the legislature in the Naylor Act is to allow the school districts to recover their investment in surplus property while making it possible for other agencies of the government to acquire the property and keep it available for recreational purposes. And that recreational property is subject to the Naylor Act if certain conditions are met. And those conditions are that the property has to consist of land that has been used for playground, playing fields, recreational purposes for at least 8 years, and is open space particularly suited for recreational purposes. If so, if the property falls within these categories, then the property is subject to the Naylor Act and has to be offered to the following entities, and it is offered in this order. First to the city, then to any park or recreation district, then to any regional park authority, and then to the county. And each of these agencies have 60 days to respond to the district's offer. Now, under the Naylor Act, the price is limited by the Ed Code. Again, this goes back to the preference for keeping property that is subject to the act available for the public. The sales price is limited by the Ed Code, and what the Ed Code says is that the sale price to any of these entities cannot exceed the price the district paid to acquire the site, which is prorated if the site is reduced so that only the space that is for recreational use is offered to these entities. And then it's adjusted from the date of purchase by a standard cost of living adjustment. And the district can also recoup some of the improvements that they've made over the year. In any event, when this calculation is made, the district cannot offer it for less than 25% of the fair market value. Now, if it's to be leased, then the annual lease rate cannot be more than 1/20th of the sales price that's determined pursuant to the calculation that we just discussed. I see a couple of hands raised. Do we have questions?
Yes, I'm Trey and I do. So I'm just curious, I mean, on the Naylor Act, I mean, I'm assuming that these properties qualify under those pre-qualifying rules that you had up. Otherwise, I wouldn't think that we'd be spending too much time on it. Is that correct?
Well, as I started the presentation, I said that I'm for you guys to have, for the committee to have the most information possible. I am going over things that may or may not apply to the particular properties of interest. But after my presentation, Tail Realty will go through each of the sites and talk about the particular disposition that's best suited for them. So during that portion of it, they will discuss whether or not the property is subject to the Naylor Act.
Okay, great.
Ms. Torres?
Hi, this is Samantha. I had a similar question, just, I guess my question, not exactly the same thing, but what initiates the Naylor Act? Is this by default, as soon as a property becomes identified as surplus, it triggers the Naylor Act? Or is it something that is by public demand, or how does this process begin?
So once the property is declared surplus, the valuation that the consultants do to determine, highest and best use is to determine whether or not that property is subject to the Naylor Act. Because that then sets in the process of who do you have to give notification to. And then additionally, you'll see on the slide, we haven't quite gotten to it yet, but now's a good time to talk about it, which is the district doesn't have to offer the entirety of the site, right? The district can say that you want to retain a portion of it that has buildings or doesn't have buildings, so that you could sell off the portion that isn't subject to the Naylor Act at a fair market value instead of at a decreased price. Just declaring it surplus will then set in motion the requirement to evaluate whether or not the Naylor Act is applicable before it is either sold or leased.
Mr. Gosney?
Thank you. Two of the sites, there are no buildings at all on.
Three of
Not
them.
recently at least. But Portola had a building recently, and of course, Adams still has a building, but do you have to when you start considering the part of the property that can be used, used for park purposes, for instance, do you have to consider what's there now or what was there when the buildings were, or the site was being used as a school? It says the portal of the building is gone. There at Terra Hills, it's Seaview, the building is gone. There at the Hilltop, it's gone.
Well, Don Harmon Knowles has a park occupying part of the parcel, remember? And that
Yes.
park has been there for quite a while, so it seems like that's the natural Naylor Act property.
But when it was a school, a great deal more of the property was used for recreational. I mean, it's a school. Yeah, anything that's not in the classroom, the kids are playing. And so it seems severely limit the footprint of the available space that can be used or considered to be surplus for commercial purposes. Am I incorrect?
Well, that's not, there's a named park there at Harmon Knowles. And you know, it's called Hilltop Park. And that's been in use for some years. And it occupies it, if you will, trespasses on district property.
I
Well,
understand.
I was just gonna say, there is a look back period of 8 years. So it's not just that historically or from the genesis forward that there has been a use as school or recreation. There is a time limit associated with the look back. And I know that later this evening, as Terra Realty goes through each of the site, that will be an opportunity to discuss those questions with them. And I think they're prepared to provide that analysis.
Right.
Sit back and wait.
I'm almost done. I'll talk fast. All right, so then that gets us past the Naylor Act and into what we do with recreational property. So recreational property, separate from the Naylor Act, is make a written offer for the purchase or sale for park or recreational purposes to any park or recreation district of the city or county in which the property is located, to regional park authorities with jurisdiction over the property, and then to any applicable state resource agency that might be interested. And that's the state park system, the Fish and Game, Coastal Commission, et cetera. There's a whole host of those state resource agencies. If none of the public agencies that are entitled to that priority offering that we've just discussed, if no one wants it, or the district is unsuccessful in negotiating either a purchase or sale, then that's the green light for the district to go forward with formal bidding. So when the district is going to either sell or lease the property, they actually have to bid it. And there are steps to the formal bidding that allows for a lot of opportunity for public notice and public input, so that the district has the best option of receiving the highest price for the property. First, the district will adopt a resolution of intent that will include a description of the property, the minimum price, the terms and conditions of any sale or lease, and the dates for which sealed bids will be considered. Additionally, in that process, the district has to provide notice to the previous owner of the property that they're intending to sell or lease it. This is an odd one that I get asked about all the time. And the reason for that is many times the district obtains property from individuals with the intent that the property forevermore be used for school purposes. Sometimes that gets transferred into a deed, sometimes it does not. So this is just intended to notify owners, if you can find them, that the district is intending to sell it, so that if there has been any constraints on the conveyance, that the parties can discuss that. And then the district must post and publish a notice of receiving bids. Those bids are opened in a regular public meeting. And then the fun part of it is that, similar to an auction, when those bids are opened and received by the board, there's an opportunity for any bidder that is present to increase their bid if they're not the highest bid. And the statute says that the district can consider any bid that's at least 5% higher than the highest bid before oral auction. And so that can be exciting. I've been a part of some of those where the bidders come and there's a nice robust public auction that goes on as the bidders try to outbid each other. Just an opportunity for the district to hopefully get the highest price. So then if the district does decide to accept one of the offers of purchase or offers to lease, the education code does provide specific uses of those proceeds. I'm just going to go over this very generally because it can be very convoluted. If there are questions, they can be submitted to the district and we'll make sure that those questions are answered. But this is a topic that we could talk about for a really long time and we just don't have time to do that tonight. But essentially the education code specifies that a school district can use the sale proceeds for capital outlay expenses or for cost of maintenance of school property that will not recur within a 5-year period. They also have the option of depositing the proceeds into a general fund if the governing board and the state allocation board determine that the school district has no anticipated needs for building construction for a 10-year period following the sale, and that the district has no major deferred maintenance requirements. And the district has an option to use the proceeds for one-time expenditure, and then they're specifically prohibited from using the proceeds for ongoing expenditures such as salary and other operating expenses. For lease proceeds, the district has greater flexibility with what they can do with the funds. It's not as expressly handled in the education code as the sale proceeds are. It is generally accepted that lease proceeds can be expended without the same limitations imposed. And the Office of Public School Construction has taken an approach that lease proceeds derived from a lease of 1 year or less can be used for general fund purposes, but that lease proceeds from leases of longer duration must be put in a capital fund for restricted use. So next we're going to talk about what happens if either property is not considered surplus, or in many of these circumstances, the district doesn't convene a 7-Eleven committee. These are the options that are available to it. The most typical one is joint use. There's also a joint occupancy, a property exchange. Workforce housing does not require that property be deemed for surplus or go through a 7-Eleven process. Facilities that are not operated or constructed for school use. There's also a waiver process that I'll briefly talk about, as well as a fee generating facilities provision, and then the Community Recreation Act. We'll go over these very briefly, but each of these are options that do not require the property to be deemed surplus and do not require the 7-Eleven process. So the list under the joint use statutes, the district can lease space in an operating school building to other school districts, educational agencies, governmental agencies, nonprofit institutions, businesses, etc. But the limitations of that particular statute is that the term of that use cannot exceed 5 years, and the district has to charge fair market rent. The only exception to those two limitations is if you have a public entity that's the party jointly using the site with the district that's making capital improvements. They don't have to then pay fair market rate, and the 5-year term doesn't apply. The thought behind that is if people are making capital improvements, they're going to want to use it for longer than 5 years. Prior to entering into a joint use agreement, though, the district's board must make certain findings, and those findings generally are that the use will not interfere with the educational program or activities that are conducted on the site. It won't unduly disrupt the residents of the surrounding neighborhood, and the use does not jeopardize the safety of the children that attend that school. Joint occupancy is probably one of the lesser used options that basically is used with larger capital program improvements. We see this a lot in public-private partnerships. Before advertising or issuing for requests for proposals for this, the board again has to provide public notice by passing a resolution of intent. After that resolution of intent is adopted, then the board has to publish that once a week for 3 weeks. The proposals are opened in a public meeting, and then the board would select a proposal that best meets the district. I think a common theme that you can see in each of these options is that the legislature has really written into the statutes the ability of the public to participate and have notice in this process. That is because the property is definitely considered a public asset, right? Exchange, I believe that Terra Realty probably will talk to you guys about exchange. It is the most flexible and popular option for property. And the reason for that is that it allows the district to exchange any of its real property for real property of another entity. The Ed Code allows a lot of flexibility for this option, and it says that the exchange can be on terms and the conditions the parties agree without complying with any of the other disposition requirements. And what that means is if the district decides to exchange its property instead of selling it, instead of leasing it, then it doesn't have to offer the property to any of those prior public priority offerings that we talked about before. What the district could do is just simply negotiate an exchange of property for property, and by 2/3 vote of a resolution declaring its intent, it can go ahead and move forward with exchanging property. The next two, I'm not going to spend too much time on because I don't think that they will be discussed by Terra Realty, but both of these options do not require a 7-Eleven committee or a finding of the property to be surplus. And those are instances in which the district decides to utilize its property to develop workforce housing or for property not operated or constructed for school use. The next one is fee generating facility. This one, the district could solicit proposals and enter into agreements with private entities for the design, construction, or reconstruction of certain types of fee producing infrastructure projects. A fee producing infrastructure project means that it will be paid for by the persons or entities that are benefited from the or utilizing that facility. That typically is more like municipal projects, water district, water projects, that sort of thing. A private entity is selected by a competitive negotiation process and not by formal bidding, and the maximum term can be 35 years for that type of use. And then lastly, another disposition that's potentially available that doesn't require a finding of it being surplus is under the community recreation. So the district can lease its property, including buildings, under this Ed Code provision to any public authority. And a public authority is a public corporation or district having authority to provide recreation. The term of that lease is not limited to 5 years like the joint use. So this one offers a little more flexibility with regard to the term. And the district can continue to charge for the use of those facilities. And this one is oftentimes used in instances where you have a public authority that wants to make some capital improvements and utilize the space for community recreation purposes. So that is the end of my presentation.
Mr. God,
Thank you very much. It was a tremendous amount of information. I'm very appreciative. I will pull up the transcript later on to be able to follow it all again. Unfortunately, the questions I had were from about 12 pages back, and I just can't remember what my questions were anymore. There's so much into my mind since then. So
Yeah, we felt like this is probably going to be a lot of information. That's why I had indicated that if you guys have questions, to please submit those and we'll get answers to you.
I have a question, quickly, Nancy, before we finish up with your section. Again, thank you again for, this very succinct, I think it was a very succinct summary. Yes, it was a lot, but I think you really covered a lot of the high points. I did have a question about, I know you mentioned a couple of the alternatives to surplus were rare. What are some of the more common when an alternative to surplus is selected, by 7-Eleven committees or by the districts? What are the more common ones?
So typically the most common ones are to exchange the property. I think that that's usually the most attractive because it provides the most flexibility of all of the dispositions. Obviously, what constrains that is whether or not the district needs other property. Usually we see that in a district that has the easiest example is growth in a certain area, and it doesn't have property in that area. It can exchange property within that area to meet its needs for a new school. That's typically the most common is the exchange. I would say lately, some sort of joint use or community rec has been very common, just simply because community members, community agencies want to partner with each other to provide recreational space, and there's a common pooling of money. And then I think lastly, probably teacher housing, workforce housing. That's a huge one right now with our districts trying to provide affordable housing for their teachers. And so, you know, that's recognized by the legislature as not requiring it to be surplus and not requiring it to have priority offerings. So that's another very common one right now. So it just depends. I think that Scott and Barry probably will go over each of the sites and let you know what's the highest and best use and discuss all the potential so that you know more site specific, which was what I was trying to avoid, because my goal was to just let you know, here are all the potential options.
If I may, for Ms. Torres's question, one of the most practical ones now in the Bay Area of Alameda, Santa Clara, San Mateo counties is declining enrollment. And with declining enrollment comes the lack of revenue for districts to keep programs in place. So the change option gives the district the ability to exchange their property for another piece of property that might produce income. And then down the road, 25, 50 years, if the district needed another piece of property, they would have that property to exchange back for a potential school site. So you have both benefits. One, keep programs in the district now because of declining enrollment, lack of revenue, or a recession, and the advantage of you haven't sold a property and then it's gone, and once the money's gone, then you're done.
So, piggybacking off of Barry here, when, if any of the alternates to surplus are selected, are the limitations on how any profits can be used by the district?
Yes.
Yeah, so if it's not sold and it's leased, then as we talked, the use of lease revenue has more flexibility for the district on what it's used for.
Nancy, could you respond to the part of, I think, where Ms. Torres is coming up with? Let's say a property was exchanged for a commercial piece of property and produced some revenue. Let's say $1 million a year or $500,000. That $500,000 that came in, the district would own the exchanged piece of property, and the revenue from that, what are the limitations on that revenue coming into the district? I think
So-
that's where you were going.
Yes, that's a perfect example. Thank you.
So, but is the revenue being generated because you're receiving lease participation or because you're receiving revenue pursuant to a lease that you entered into for the,
Revenue from the lease.
yeah, so it's lease payment. So that can be put into the district's general fund. The only caveat with that is that OPSC has provided guidance that if the lease is for more than a year, it should really be put into a capital fund, a restricted fund. That isn't what the statute provides. So you'd have to like proceed with caution there. We'd have to look at whatever the particular parameters of the lease agreement were to make it a legal opinion at that point. But there is greater flexibility for those lease payments, and in some circumstances, they can be put into the general fund.
I think the state's concurring with, they want to look at long-term and not short-term.
Mhm.
And so they're looking for more capital improvements rather than operating expenses. And I think Nancy would concur with that.
And just for the sake of the committee, OPSC is the Office of Public School Construction. And SAB, which was shared a little bit earlier, also related to this topic, is the State Allocation Board. And we'll put together a little acronym guide for the committee to help you walk through this presentation. Nancy, it doesn't look like we have any other hands at this time. We really want to thank you for taking the time to come tonight and really share with us this educational foundation and this crash course in public property. I imagine many of us might go back through the slides, and this recording will also be available on YouTube. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And
All
so
right.
with further ado, we'll jump to our second presentation, and I'll begin to share slides.
Thank you,
Thank
Nancy.
you. Good night.
And so Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So appreciate the opportunity to be here again in front of the committee and talk and piggyback on some of the things that Nancy and her firm have given you information on. Again, there's a lot of information there. We're going to cover a lot of that, or actually start applying some of that, or giving you some options to apply that. So if you could go to the next slide. And I'll also say that a lot of the stuff you've seen before, but I think you're going to, maybe it will be much more helpful for you now to have it in a context of looking at it, and then having an overview from Nancy, and then looking at it again, and being able to then start understanding what your options might be. So again, the 4 sites that are subject to the 7-Eleven committee's purview are the ones that you see now. Next. And again, geographically, that's where they're spread out throughout the district boundary, and you can see within the city limits and all of that. So we'll start in alphabetical order with Adams, and again, next slide. So as you all know, no, go back, sorry. Thank you. So as you know, that this site is geographically challenged. It is it's an odd shape. It looks like a duck to me. So again, it's an odd shaped piece of property. It's got topography challenges, and again, you can see where the buildings are in terms of the center, kind of the south center or lower center of the property, and then off to the side where it shows Adams Middle School off to the right. That's a field area, it's blacktop. And then it benches down, and there's another blacktop area. Off to the left-hand side, up along Arlington at Patterson, that's a very steep slope through there. And actually the right-of-way right through there is actually owned by the county on the slope side of it. And then the center part of that is, I'm not sure what it was used for in the past. It's fallow now. And then there's a blacktop area that's just a little bit to the downward side of that. 8.5 acres is what we're talking about in terms of the size of the property. So next.
We have a question, Scott, Mr.
Oh,
Gossie?
okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry, thank you. You mentioned the slope area with the right of way. Can you point out where you're referring? So
I'd
Well-
love to be able to do that bit, but I can't. So Melissa, if you could be my eyes and ears, no, if you can go up. Up, up, up,
Yeah.
up. Okay, just a little bit. Now that area right there. So that there's a fairly significant slope right through there. And that slope is owned by in this case, the county, because it's all county right through there. So that area right there.
Okay, so you're talking above your yellow line?
Correct.
All right, thank you. That clarifies things.
Okay. So here's again some photos, and again that area that I'm talking about is on the left-hand photo would be right to the right of that, and it slopes down. And yes, thank you. And then again the slope area where the right-hand picture, you can kind of see that same slope area, you know, in the middle of the picture, if you will. So that's kind of shooting across that field. So again, the topography is, you know, it kind of benches as flat and then it benches. And again, I think you've all probably been by that, but it's always helpful to, from a contextual point of view, put this all into perspective of looking at it in a plan view and then looking at it in an elevation view, which is the elevation view of photos. So next. And those are the two areas that I was talking about off to the one side of the buildings, that upper area and the lower area. So that's the topography part of it. The other part of it that, you know, we talked about and we'll talk about again is what the existing entitlements are through the county. Again, this is all in unincorporated Contra Costa County. And you'll see on the left-hand slide, the Adams, it's a public service or a semi-public service. So it's basically designated by the county as for public uses. It could be schools, it could be cities, it could be park and rec and those kinds of things. And that's the general plan designation. On the right-hand side, you can see they are going through, they being the county, are going through a general plan update. And one of the things to be aware of is that general plan update has started, but they're not anticipating actually adopting a new general plan until probably late 23 or into the first part of 2024. So one of the recommendations that we'll have, and we've given before, we'll talk about again on both Adams as well as Seaview, both of which are in the county, are you know, making sure that whatever the district decides and this committee decides that they would like to recommend is that those kinds of issues are addressed with the county through the planning process, and that appropriate zoning and general plan designations are put into place that will assist the district in achieving what they want to achieve.
May I ask a question, please? With respect to the general plan, does the general plan stand as a constraint on however the property is used?
If it's being used for public purposes such as schools, no. If you were to say, I would like to develop this property for something other than a public use, then yes, you would have to make a change in order to have the jurisdiction allow that use. And the change would come even if unless it was for workforce housing, Nancy talked about that, then the jurisdictions don't have as much authority over those kinds of things. But if it's for a private party or you know, something along those lines, then yes, then you would have to go through that process. School districts would normally be exempt from that because they're farther up the food chain, if you will, because they're a state agency. So a school district could go in and say, gee, I like this piece of property, it's an industrial area, I'm going to build a school. And providing you can solve the CEQA issues related to that, then you can build a school there. I'm not saying you should, but you could. So but when it comes to doing something with this property, if it's not going to be used for school purposes, then this is something that is going to have to be addressed in order to make sure that it is something that somebody else might want. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Beautiful. So again, there's a general plan, and that is a document that all cities and counties have. And that is basically a very broad brush stroke of land use and land use areas and things like that. It's general plans can be changed statutorily only 4 times per year. And then there are certain guidelines for housing and things like that that the local agency has to update every 5 years. In the zoning, is the underline, but that starts giving more specificity in terms of if there's a particular zone there, what can you do with that? In the case of Adams, the current zoning, even though the general plan is basically a public, semi-public use, the underlying zoning is R6. And you can see that the R6 extends pretty much everywhere around the existing school. So if you're looking at that, then you're saying, well, in theory, if I change the general plan, then I should be able, being in compliance with the zoning, be able to develop 6 units per acre. That's basically what that designation means. Now, one of the things, again, that we talked about that's a constraint on this property is seismic issues. And that has to do with, in this case, geotechnical and geologic issues. It is, and as you can see, it's in an Alquist Priola zone, which identifies it as a very significant area in terms of potential ground movement and motion. And the yellow line that you're seeing through there, very broad line through there, encompasses the school site. So those areas then have special requirements for construction and other, what kind of uses can be there and things like that. So again, that's something that's probably less immutable and less easy to change than the zoning and the general plan. But again, it's something to be aware of in terms of how anybody would look at the site, or most people would look at the site in terms of what kind of uses and what would be required of that. So we talked before about potential opinions of value. That's really important in our from our perspective to have the 7-Eleven committee understand if you're making decisions, what does that really mean? It's one thing to make a decision if there's a $10 impact. It's another decision to make, or a threshold to make if it's $1 million. So again, I think it's really important to have that background information. So what we had made some assumptions on, because that's what we can do and all we can do, is that, from the highest and best use perspective, knowing what we know, that single family homes would be a good potential use. And then I'm not factoring in some of the constraints like the Alquist Priola and things like that. Those are all, you can all build in there, and you can clearly see there's lots of building in that area, but there are other costs that go along with that. But making the assumption that 6 units per acre and that you have roughly 6 acres of usable land, I know there's 8.85, but a lot of that is in slope and other things, then obviously subject to more geotech research and there's a demo cost that would come along with that. That comps in the area look like they're in the $25 to $35 per square foot range for that kind of product. And that would impute a value of somewhere between $6.5 and $9 million.
If I can interrupt for just a second.
Certainly.
A bare lot with no improvements was recently sold in my neighborhood, and I live within a mile of this campus. And without knowing the exact purchase cost, I know it was on the market for about $40 a square foot. And that had been on the market for some years. The projected sale price of the house on there, and even though the lot is substandard, it's actually 43 feet in width, the frontage. The sale price that the builder is hoping for is 1.4 million. So you're looking again at the numbers and wondering about where the comps were. The property the lot that I'm talking about was nothing more than someone's front yard, and they split the lot and sold off the house and then sold off the front yard as a bare lot. So we're there was a question raised in the public comment feature about possibly the number being a little bit low in terms of the projected value of the property. So I guess my question is, is the discounted value a result of figuring in the demolition cost of the existing buildings?
Oh, well, let me answer a little bit broader than that. So we ran comps in that entire area. And I think I know which lot you're talking about because we did track that. There was a couple of lots that just sold recently or
Right.
on the market and were in escrow. So there's a couple of things about how you value land. And land is a residual calculation. So if, you know, and it depends on, you know, at the end of the day, a developer is going to come in and say, I can build, you know, a product on this piece of property. I can sell it for this amount of money. It's going to cost me this much money to get there. And that would be both hard cost, soft cost, and profit. And whatever's left over is what I can afford to pay for the property. So that is absolutely 99% of all how you value land comes from that. Comps are really important, but comps actually usually end up supporting that. So when we looked at all of this, and again, I'm conservative in terms of how I'm approaching this, because what we're trying to do, not only with the committee, but with the board and with the community, is to set expectations and say, okay, here's what we believe. And what we believe based on the market and the comps and the research that we did, that the value is in a range of that. The other thing, when you're looking at a one-off lot, like what you're explaining, James, if I understand, if it's the same lot, that all of the offsite work is done and there's really no in-tract work that needs to happen. So if it fronts onto a street, there's nothing else that needs to go in there. On a property like this, there's no in-tract lot. So that takes a hit to value because somebody's got to come in and put streets in. They've got to extend utilities. They've got to do all those things to create the lot that is basically a finished lot of what you're saying. This is a tentative map lot. So at a tentative map, there's different stages. I'm sorry, this is a really important thing. And so I'm hoping that this would be really helpful. So there's different stages of lot development. There's a tentative map lot development stage, and there's a final map, and then there's a finished lot. So the tentative map is where everything is laid out on paper. And then a developer can come in and say, okay, I can get 36 lots like we're showing. And here's where the streets are going to go. And it's a piece of paper. And then there's a finished lot value map, or not, excuse me, a final map. And that's where all the utilities, everything is done right down to the construction drawings. And then there's the finished lot where you actually go in and do all of that. So what you're explaining is a finished lot. I'm explaining, and this is priced on a tentative lot basis. So does that?
Right. No, I understand the difference. But when I say it was bare ground, I really mean bare ground. No sewer hookup, no curb cut. So everything from the curb to the back line had to be put in.
But it was on a street.
It does front on the street. And I give you it fronts on a street. It also has a comparable view similar to what you would find at Adams.
Is it in the Alquist Priola zone? Because I think it's not.
I suspect not.
That's a huge thing.
Scott, I think it's also important to point out, these are opinions. We are conservative, but it isn't Terra Realty that determines the price. It's the marketplace. So if we're off, that will self-correct itself because of the amount of people that will want to come in and raise the price.
Right, okay.
If we're also off on the other side, that could be reflected also. And I think the other question that Mr. Green asked earlier, and I believe he's still on, you'll see the last bullet that Scott put there. We're not sure what the demo cost would be because there are some hazardous materials there. That would have to come off of that value also, which depending on whether it was in a sale or an exchange, could be part of the negotiations and increase the net amount to the district. In other words, if we identified there was something in there that there was a cost, they would give the district X and pay for it, absorb that cost. Now, they're very sharp people too. They're going to figure out exactly as Scott had said, what it takes to go from a paper lot on paper to the finished lot where they can actually build based on all the codes, based on the requirements of the entity, which in this case would be the county.
Okay, so just to sort of wrap it up, the happy circumstance would be that we come up with a tentative value and the bidding process corrects it with respect to the market value. Is that, am I hearing you correctly?
Correct. An example for that would be, we gave a school district an estimate of value based on the use that the proposer had proposed. And because of the marketplace and the location of where this was, it came in about 40% higher.
Okay,
Now, that's not guaranteeing that'll happen on this site, but we didn't determine the price. The marketplace determines the price. The Board of Education gets to determine whether that's acceptable.
okay.
And just to jump in on top of this, it's escaping me a little bit why we're even targeting the revenue from a sale as an important talking point, because to me, whether it's 10 million or 25 million, in the end, where that money is used is sort of out of this committee's purview to me. If it's an outright sale, it sounds like that then the board gets to use those funds in whatever method they choose, depending on the way the property is disposed of. So I'm a little bit confused as to why the actual market rate is a large part of the focus for each individual property, as opposed to, the actual just endpoint of whether or not it's a lease or a sale or the best use or an exchange or what have you.
Mr. Holland, you're absolutely correct. The decision-making authority is with the Board of Education and what they want to do, but the committee has the authority to recommend to the Board of Education what the interest of the community might be, whether it's a sale, whether it's an exchange, whether it's a project with another agency. You can do that as a committee.
Well,
You can't make the decision.
understood. I'm just trying to try and get to a place. I mean, as I step back and look at it big picture, I'm just trying to say, like, if we've said, you know what, we can't decide any better use for this particular property as opposed to a sale. I guess I'm trying to look at the sale is like obviously a large piece of what might happen, but in the end, does it really matter for this committee's purpose, how much money that potentially might bring in?
Well, if I can answer that, and I agree with you, we're spending a lot of time on this, but it is important, and it's important because part of the 7-Eleven process is to look at, and Nancy went through that in her presentation earlier, for the district or the committee to understand what the values are or what the opinions of value are, and that could be done through an appraisal. We did an opinion of value because we do this a lot, and again, it's a reference point. And so it's actually a required part of a 7-Eleven process. At the same time, I don't want to spend a lot more time on that, but it is an important part to have context for all of this. But that's really kind of the alpha and the omega on that.
So we have one more question in the Q&As from Mr. Geen. Do we have a ballpark for demo costs?
No. I know that was a very quick answer.
To elaborate just a bit, the reason being is we have not been able to identify exactly what needs to be demoed based on the use. And the other part is post-COVID, cost of demolition have increased greatly because of the disposal issues.
The other thing is the district could say, we want to figure out, maybe somebody comes in and says, we can use these buildings. I mean, there's just, again, there's a lot of different moving parts here, and I don't want to get any farther down in the weeds than we are right now, but there's, again, understanding the overall overarching the cost that the demo, we couldn't, without going out and actually hard bidding it and everything else, so we just don't have a number on that. So, all right, so here's the, kind of the loop around on, and we're going to do this on each one of the properties. So the questions that we would like the board to consider, the committee to consider is this site, should it be surplus? Is there educational needs that the district would have that they could use this site for? And then if the recommendation is to surplus the site, what are the follow-up recommendations? Should we use the property to create a new source of income? Should we work with the County Board of Supervisors to rezone the property? Should it be sold? What should we do with it? One of the things that Nancy brought up is the Naylor Act, and we looked at each one of the properties that we're talking about tonight. And from the determination that we have with the constraints is that none of the properties would be subject to the Naylor Act if it was surplused and sold in a traditional way. The Naylor Act does not come into play if you're exchanging or doing a joint occupancy ground lease. So again, those are things that, to keep in the back of your head on that. And part of the thing, I mean, the committee could say, well, we'd like to, make a recommendation and we keep some of that for park area. And that's fine. That's your, what's your recommendation? Understanding what the needs of the district are, which is for money, understanding what the needs of the community are, which is for maybe something else. So that's the decision points that you as a committee are going to need to talk about and then come up with a recommendation. So I see Lewis.
Mr. Gosney has a question. He's with us computer right now.
I'm concerned about your statement that the Naylor Act probably would not apply to this Adams site, and that I'm looking at the tenor of the community here, that they want to turn everything into public parks. And if you got 65% of Adams site that has been used for recreational purposes, playground area, for the kids, they could easily say that we want to just turn this into a public park there. And that essentially the county would come in and pick it up for pennies on the dollar. And that would have a huge impact on any recommendation that we would make. It's almost imperative that we get a feeling from the county even before we make a recommendation. Is this an avenue that we should anticipate that they would try to go with? Especially looking at the supervisor that is overseeing this particular area, that has already tried to take the Point Mulati Naval Fuel Depot and turn it from a multi-billion-dollar development into a park. So it is a concern for me, and I need you to convince me that the Naylor Act would not apply to this, and that the county would not be anxious to just snatch it up from underneath our hands.
Well, I can tell you for a fact, and which that Nancy was on, but she can confirm this, and she did confirm it, that if you exchange property, if a district exchanges property, the Naylor Act does not apply. If the district ground leases through the joint occupancy provision of the Ed Code, that their piece of property, the Naylor Act does not apply. And as we looked at the properties and we went through and did the test of the Naylor Act on each one of the properties, none of them complied. So now the only one that could theoretically come close to complying is Harmon Knolls, because a portion of that is currently being used as park. So that one would probably, and I'd want Nancy to opine on that, but all the rest of them did not meet the test, the legal test of if you were to go through a surplus process to sell it, you would not have to offer it under the Naylor Act.
Okay, I apologize. I think I probably skipped that day in law school, but you have to explain to me how that this, if it had been used for decades and decades and decades for recreational purposes by the district, how that would not apply.
Because the law states that it has to have been used in the last 8 years.
So I thought that, I looked at the slide earlier and it made it sound like it had been used for 8 years for
No.
recreational,
No,
not in
that's,
the past 8 years.
that's a requirement for it to apply for the Naylor Act. But again, that's only if you're going to go through a surplusing process. If you say, I mean, again, there's different options that, the committee could say, no, we want the district to keep this for educational purposes. That's an option. I don't think it's a very good option, but it's an option. The district could say, or the committee could say, we would like to consider this property surplus, but we would recommend the board go through an exchange process to create revenue. Then that's a process that does not have anything to do with the Naylor Act. There's no impact at all. There's no legal nexus to that. And as I understand it, in talking to Nancy before, if the district the committee says, let's surplus the property, it does not apply legally. Now, that doesn't mean politically, legally, that you would have to go through the Naylor Act. Does that help? I think, Don, that was you that was talking, correct?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yes, it does help, but I think this would be one of those numerous questions that I would reaching out to Nancy for clarification on.
Okay, and
I
she's,
read in the slide, what you just said don't seem to be the same thing.
I think I'm saying exactly the same thing that she said. I sure hope I am.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so that's this is the discussion. That's why I labeled it discussion, and that's terrific. So again, there's different options, and what the committee is going to need to do is think about all of this and lay that and overlay that on, what's in the best interest of the community and the district in terms of forming a recommendation. All right, we'll move on. So Harmon Knolls. So we already started talking about that a little bit. So again, the next slide should show you the area here, and the entire property is just a little under 9 acres, as you can see. I bifurcated. It's one parcel, but I bifurcated it, basically showing the area that was where the old educational facility, where most of the land is laying fallow now. Thank you. And then there's a park area, a little under 3 3/4 acres right there, that is basically part of the city of Richmond Park off to the left. And that parcel off to the left is about 2 acres of property. And there was an agreement that the district had with the city on that lease, and that agreement expired a couple of years ago. But again, in our discussions with the city of Richmond, I know that they would like to continue, I'm not sure that, maintaining the park is the right way, because the park it's not perfectly maintained. Let's put it that way. And that is their responsibility. So, again, you can see, and it kind of overlaying on that clearly that one portion of the Harmon Knolls site would probably, if the district were to say, we want to surplus and sell that, it would be subject to, at least that one portion would probably be subject to the Naylor Act if you were to go down that process. But at the same time, you could say, okay, I want to exchange, and it would not be subject to the Naylor Act. So again, this is a pictures. Again, you've seen this before. The left-hand side is the upper part, sort of the fallow land. And then the right-hand side is, the kind of the entrance into the park. And then you can see the park kind of beyond that. There you go. There's a little bit more clear pictures on both of those. Okay. So again, this particular property in the city of Richmond is currently zoned Park and Rec. The zoning is basically a public park and rec type zoning, and you can see that on both the slides, the one on the left and the one on the right, surrounded by residential property. That's the yellow area right there, and that's a lower density single family. Primarily, there's some multifamily that is fairly close there also. The next. So again, going through and having a framework on an opinion of value, we, what we felt, if from a development perspective, medium density townhome, and we only used 5 acres of the site, not the park area site, the 3 3/4 acre site. 18 units to the acre and approximately 90 new townhomes. And again, the value ranges are somewhere between $35 and $39 a square foot for the land, which would impart a value of somewhere between 7.6 and $8.5 million. Again, that's information that, in our opinion, is important to have as you're looking at this thing. Again, if it's $100,000, it's just different than if it's 8 million. So again, from a discussion purpose and from the board or the committee's purpose, excuse me, the question to ask: should this site is this site surplus to the district educational needs? Does the district need any part of this site? That's a question you have to ask. If the recommendation is a surplus, then what are the follow-up? Is it important for the district to create new sources of income? Is it important for the city to work with the city of Richmond and address the 3 3/4 acre site? And again, we talked about the Naylor Act considerations, which again do not apply in a ground lease or in a exchange, but they would apply if you were to surplus it. And again, the committee could say, no, we think the district could use this site in the future for educational purposes, in which case you would say, well, maybe I don't want to surplus it. But those are the options, and those are the things that we would like the committee to consider. Yes, Louis.
Mr. Gosney has his hand raised.
Thank you. With regards to the 3.8 acres that is currently being used as a park, if the Naylor Act did apply on that, and the city of Richmond wanted to take permanent possession, what kind of valuation might we expect for a piece of land that's just going to be used for a park?
Not much. And the reason for that is that I don't know, we'd have to go back and research. I think we've got that, what the district paid for that property. And it's basically going to be about 25% of what they paid for it.
One of the things that I would like to add for this site is, of the 4 sites being considered in this process, this is probably the only site for which the California Department of Education, CDE, would allow us to build school facilities. And I think that's an important consideration for the committee to know.
Thank you, Melissa. That's a terrific point. I know we made that before, but again, the Adams site, it would be very, very difficult because of the geotechnical issues there. Yeah, this one would probably, again, there's nothing obvious, in terms of constraints to do something with the site for educational purposes. So this would probably be the only site that would really, fit the bill, if you will.
Can I ask a question regarding the history of the site? Did the city of Richmond and the school district come to a mutual understanding that the surrounding neighborhood expected a school to be built there as a condition of the development?
That's a question that I don't know, because the district acquired this property quite some time ago. And I don't know what if there was anything. I mean, in our experience, there's a lot of times developers that are building around a site that is designated as a potential school site will say, look, there's going to be a school there, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be a school there. It means that it's designated for that. And then again, school districts need to make decisions based on, is there a demand and a need for that? And then how do they acquire, or not acquire, but how do they construct that? So I do know, and we shared this before, that there are CC&Rs, which are conditions, covenants, and restrictions that were put in place on all of the development in the surrounding area, including this property, that basically stated that if this property was not going to be used for school purposes, is that it would go for some kind of a higher density type land use.
Okay.
So that is in the CC&Rs. And we shared that at the first presentation that we did. Or this, excuse me, it was a second presentation.
Mr. God.
Thank you. I work very closely with the neighborhood council there in that community, and they are still under the belief that, through the numerous discussions over the many years, that if Highland Elementary School is rebuilt, that it may be rebuilt on that site. And so you do have a political issue there. If all of a sudden they find out that it's not going to be rebuilt there, or that Highland Elementary School is never going to be rebuilt. Considering the lack of funds we have, that may be a real possibility, at least in my lifetime. But it's something that this committee needs to consider. That's the only site out of the 4, I believe, where that is an option. It's just as you pointed out, that it may be used for educational services.
And I agree with that. And again, you know, as the committee is deliberating and pondering this, a lot of information that you're getting, you know, one of the things, I mean, there's economic considerations, there's practical considerations, there's zoning considerations, and there's political considerations. So all of those, and again, at the end of the day, it's up to the committee to come up with the recommendation that, you know, is best suited, that matches what the district, you know, goals and desires are with the community's goals and desires are. And sometimes those are not exactly in alignment, but that's part of the mission of what the 7-Eleven committee is supposed to do.
Mr. Gosney?
Again, on the same thread, if Highland Elementary School is not going to be rebuilt at that site, I believe that this district needs to come before the neighborhood council, for instance, and just flat tell them, it just doesn't look like it's going to be rebuilt at this site. Otherwise, no matter what the school board wants to do with it, you're going to have an extremely severe pushback by that community that will keep insisting that they deserve a new elementary school, and that's the site that they were promised. But it needs to be said earlier rather than later. It's just probably not going to happen.
Well,
Thank
the
you.
committee needs to deliberate how they want to frame their recommendations, and part of the recommendations to the board could be exactly what you just said, Don. Because this is, you're going to be making recommendations to the governing board. Portola. We're in the city of El Cerrito. So I've deliberately left the spaceship in because it does really help frame all this. Again, there's some fairly significant slope issues through here. There are fairly significant land and seismic issues that you know, that are in this area from a landslide perspective. And so again, it's a spectacular piece of property from a view perspective. You know, from an educational perspective, it's probably going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to ever reconstruct an educational facility on it, because of not only because of those issues, but because of ADA and you know, just the practicality of trying to run a school on the side of a hill. So again, there's a slope I'm at the bottom on pretty much both of the pictures. The one to the left is pointing over to the north, which is where the PG&E substation is. The right-hand picture is kind of looking up the slope towards Seaview Lane. So again, to the legal, political side, or the legal side for the city of El Cerrito, it is the property is zoned institutional and utility, and you can see that in the blue area there on the left. That's the general plan, and then the zoning that lays on top of that is public, semi-public. So again, any kind of land use that were to be done, if it was outside of the of educational purposes, would require a change in both the general plan as well as the zoning. So again, in terms of opinion of value, when we looked at that as a you know, a higher density project, 15 units to the acre, kind of picking up some of the slope issues and things like that. I think that that's an achievable, you know, from a big picture perspective, which gives you about 75 new townhomes on there. Obviously, there's further geotechnical work that would need to be done. How do you stabilize the land and all of that? But the comps in that area indicate a range of values of $75 to $90 a foot, which again, as a perspective for the committee, is, 17 to $20 million. So again, when you're looking at that, there's a fairly high value when you're looking at that. Again, if the recommendation of the committee is to use that for trading for income producing property, there's some fairly significant revenues that could be obtained off of that. Again, the next slide, please.
Consider that this particular site has a PG&E substation right next door to it. You know,
Right.
where well, if you're living in a multi-story facility, you're looking down on that, you're feeling the buzz as your hair stands on end. I mean, most of the other properties I'm betting that you use for comps don't have a substation right next door to it.
I think this is done. You can actually screen those things. You can do things that you're not going out there and I'm not trying to, I'm not developing the property. I'm given a range of something. Again, if there was nothing there and it was flat land, it'd be way more than the 75 to 90 bucks a foot. So I'm trying to account for some of that. I'm not disagreeing with your assessment that there is a substation right there. But the flip side of it is that there's a really nice park on the other side, so turn left.
And Don, developers understand that and work around it.
Yes, they do. There's ways to mitigate all those kinds of things. And again, what sells that property, and we talked about this before, is the view. And that the people pay a lot of money for views. And not necessarily a substation. I'm not going to disagree with you on that, but I think there's a way to mitigate that. So again, back to the Portola and the, kind of the committee, in terms of how they want to ponder this particular piece of property. Our recommendation is that the site is probably not, of use for educational purposes. Like I said before, with the land issues, the landslide issues, the topography. And if it's the recommendation to surplus the site, what are the follow-up recommendations? Should it be used for creating a new source of income? In which case you'd need to work with the city of El Cerrito, rezone the property to maximize the value. We've had a tentative discussion with the city of El Cerrito. They didn't throw us out of the office. So I know that there was a point in time where they were looking at that from a library's perspective, or to build a new library. And again, they would have the same issues building something like that with the topography and the geotechnical issues that are there. They're also working on at the new proposed BART station area, right there, development of getting a space in there to do a new library, which is actually a pretty good location for them. So again, from the Naylor Act, I think we talked about that, that we don't believe, even if the school district were to go through a surplusing and sale process, which we don't recommend, that it would not be subject to the Naylor Act. Any questions on Portola? Seaview. So again, we're back in the county. And this property has, again, there's two portions of it, or two parts of it. There's where the original school was, that's parcel 1, that's a little over 4.5 acres. And you can see the footprint of where a lot of the blacktop parking area, play area, all of that was at one point in time. And don't hold me to it, but I believe the demo happened in around 2014. Louis, you may remember that better than me, but it was 2013, 2014, I think, somewhere in that area. So approximately 10 years ago, maybe a little less than that. So we also remember when we talked before that this particular piece of property was actually part of the subdivision back in the 70s when it was put together, where Cypress and Rosedale and Southwood are. And there were 21 lots, and I think we can go to the next. I think I got some pictures, and then I put the map in again. So this is pictures of the site. There's the Garrity Creek that separates basically the two sites right there. The one on the left, on the right-hand picture, is where the ball fields were. And then on the right, you can see I'm looking at the San Pablo Bay. The right would be where the school was. And again, the trestle right there, I'm sorry, if you go back just a second, one of the issues with, accessing the, where the fields were, is that's your access. That is the only access from a vehicle perspective, at this point in time. So again, very constrained access on that. Thank you, Melissa. So right now, again, from the planning side and from that landscape, it's zoned public, semi-public. And the general plan is residential, which wraps into, what's around there, what the general plan, what the county is looking at doing. And we had this conversation with John Joya, the supervisor in that area, is that they're designating it for a high, apartment type zoning, RLM, residential medium density, which is typically, an apartment. It could be 18 to 20 units per acre, and it could go up even higher than that, depending on, other things. The issue is, if you'll recall, and I think that's on the next slide, is, I think we're going back. Am I going backwards? Oh, this is the zoning. I'm sorry. No, we're not going back. Here we go. So, thank you. So the subdivision, the map on the left, that shows, you can see where Rosedale Court is, and that actually is where the property. So Southwood kind of frames the boundary of that. That was going to be what the development was going to be in that area right there as part of that original map. And again, the school district came in and acquired it and then consolidated all those parcels. But the key on it is that there's CC&Rs, and those CC&Rs encompass the property before the district acquired it. And if you look under number 1 right there, I've highlighted it, that no building other than a single family detached building can be built on any lot, and no use shall be made of any lot except its improvement as a single family private residence. If you go down to number 4, again, highlighted, no more than 1 dwelling unit should be erected in any building plot, no subdivision in any lot shall result in a lot of less than 6,000 square feet. So that kind of takes out the high density side of it. And we talked to Nancy Taylor about this quite some time ago and asked her to review it. And she came to the same conclusion that we did, is that that's a fairly significant impediment to going in and doing, say, condos or apartments or something like that, that the way around that would be either there's 150 lots that are subject to this particular CC&R, and you'd have to get whatever it has in the, I looked at it, I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's typically usually a 50% to +1 to agree to change the land use and to amend the CC&Rs. In our experience, that is not an easy thing to do. So again, that's an impediment it's not an impediment to developing it, because the site is very developable, but it's an impediment to developing it with anything other than what's stated in the CC&Rs, which is a single family. So.
One second, Scott. Mr. Gosney?
Thank you. With regards to getting the community to amend their CC&Rs on this, I know you said 50% +1. I can't remember how many lots you said there were.
150.
150, don't we own, what, you said 27 of them?
No, well, technically, yes, but then the district did a revert to acreage and got rid of all those lots. So in theory, that map, and I've talked to the planners, we talked to them a long time ago, in fact, 10 years ago, about resurrecting that map. And that would be a process of resurrecting the map on that. But if you did that, then you would get 21 votes out of the 150.
Okay, I know that when my folks moved into a gated community and they had their CC&Rs, it was kind of a joke that they actually had a homeowners association, but the developer owned 98% of the lots, so he had 98% of the votes. Didn't matter what the actual residents had to say.
Right.
The developer, so if we own 21 votes there, I mean, that's a head start at least. And I think it's worth considering putting out a survey, talking to the people in that area. Would you be willing?
That in order to, and that's fine. I mean, that's something, again, the goal and the mission of this committee is to, give the Board of Governors a direction on what you'd like to do. And that could be one of them, or it could be, we would like you to consider exchanging this property and getting the highest value, because what you'd want to do on that is then do another analysis of, okay, well, if I wanted to do 18 units to the acre and be able to get however many units that was, or 25 or whatever, let's say it's 25, you get a 100-unit apartment project, 25 units to the acre, would that be worth more money? That would be the question. And I don't know the answer to that question either.
Looks like we have a couple more comments. Ms. Torres?
I know, I visited the site first of all, and I will say that the photos don't do justice of the location. It has great views, a lot of space, and a lot of potential that I hadn't previously, I wouldn't have previously appreciated until I was physically there. I know that it was discussed that Harmon Knolls was the only site that was potentially available for educational use. Why couldn't this site still be used for educational purposes?
I'm gonna defer to Lewis on that. I understand why they closed it was that they have enough capacity in the other schools around there. And one of the things about this particular school is that, with the 150 people that are right there, that's great, but you have to cross over a moat to get there. And, and other housing is a long ways away, which would require busing and things like that. So again, I'll let Lewis, opine
Part of it,
further.
the actual heavy traffic with the trains that come through there and the potential for hazardous
Oh, that-
material.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, Lewis. So I don't think the CDE would allow you to build another school on there. I'm sorry, I forgot about that. Because there are 2 train tracks, there's gas pipelines that go in those on both sides of the property, it bisects it. So there's probably no way that the CDE would allow a new school to be built there.
Correct.
Um,
Mr. Gosney has his hand raised.
Yeah, I know one of the impediments too is the, I don't know if you want to call it the creek that kind of bifurcates the property. I would think that being able to, I'm not saying fill it in, I'm saying turn it into an enclosed culvert. So you've got a structure below a covered landmass that would then make it, instead of 2 pieces of property, would make it 1 big piece of property. That
Well, yeah, but
greater usage.
here's the problem with that. It's a very significant outflow to do that. I mean, you might be able to culvert part of it, but it would probably take you 10 years of going through BCDC, California Coastal Commission, and every known U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The chances of you getting that culverted would be very, very small. The other part of it is that the parcel 2, the 3.3 acres, that is all in a FEMA floodplain. So there's really no reason to go in, and because you really can't develop any of that. If you look at the pictures and you kind of see that the elevation of the parcel 1 is significantly higher than the elevation of the parcel 2. There's also a sea level change that's coming in that we looked at. It doesn't really impact parcel 1 as much because it's higher in elevation off the bay, but it does impact parcel 2.
Mr. Sanders?
Yeah, I just want to say that since I'm a retired teacher and I went there for professional development, that's a really remote site.
Mhm.
And the school as built before, there are all these little round buildings like yurts that the Mongolians might use, but they didn't work as classrooms. And it was a terrible thing to try to do anything inside those buildings. We've just about unworkable, no matter what we tried. And the last use that I was there for was professional development, but there were some offices there. And no matter what was tried, because of the design of the school, it was just about impossible to make something work well. And the remote location, driving there was not convenient. And if you think about the people who lived there in the surrounding community, depending, if you built high density housing there, the traffic impact would be considerable and not welcome, I'm sure. So if it could be R1, if somehow somebody can build some single family residents that fit into the neighborhood, that's probably the highest and best use for that property now without fighting the CC&Rs.
Another factor that the committee needs to consider, part of the reason the committee was established has to do with declining enrollment. And 20 years ago, the district had 34,000 students. Today, they have 26,000. So in 20 years, you've dropped 22%. You need fewer schools. And some of the more problematic schools in terms of location and just boundaries and all the things that Lewis and all the teams have to work on is how many schools do we need to be open? And that's a fact. And it probably is going to continue to decline because California in general's population is coming down. And then housing costs in the Bay Area are not exactly affordable.
So again, James, I'm going to agree with you on that. I mean, my sense on trying to fight, getting a change in the zoning is kind of counterintuitive to me because of exactly what you said. It's not, when you're building high density, you want to be close to services. That's the kind of person that would typically move into a higher density. You want to be able to walk places. You don't want to have to get in your car and drive places. And that's what this would be. A single family home works differently, from the profile of that. And so it's combined with that. It's combined with, what kind of value could I get out of it trying to fight that? Because from a CEQA, you're absolutely right. The CEQA protecting, that's California Environmental Quality Act. Traffic is one of the biggest issues with CEQA. And if I lived in that area and you said, well, I'm going to build 100 units in here, and and the CC&R say you can only build 21, that I think somebody could hold you up for a very long time.
Right.
So again, that's so there's two parts of that. There's a part of, and again, we're going to look at right now, which you are looking at, opinion of value. We basically came up with a value based on doing the opportunity for 21 new homes. Property values indicating $15 to $18, which is between $3 and $3.5 million plus or minus. So
Yes.
great.
Mr. Holland?
Yes, thank you. Forgive me to keep going back to big picture, but I am, my mindset is really staying the same, which is, as we look at each individual property, I realize that there is absolutely many different opinions about best use for that specific property. What I'm missing from the big picture is what thoughts have been put into construction of, say, one new campus for say school buildings that are deteriorating and need to be rebuilt, so that are 40 years old. I know a couple of sites around us are really poor and need to be rebuilt. They have portables for permanent classrooms. And so I'm trying to understand, like, if part of this committee's considerations are looking at the big picture capital expenditure situation of facilities of the schools in these areas, and then what potential large structures need to be built. Mr. Geen just brought up a point about the number of kids in the charter schools. I don't know if the numbers that you said were reflective of all of the students that are potentially in this area, or if it's just our district of students. So I just keep coming back to some of these larger questions, and I really also wanted to get to focus on the exchange possibilities, some of the other possibilities that weren't part of disposal of the property, and really trying to get into some of those intermediary decision points.
So let me answer Mr. Holland and Mr. Green's question. Those numbers have nothing to do with charter schools. Those are numbers of students that were enrolled 20 years ago and the ones that are enrolled today. It doesn't take into account who went to private school, who went to charter school. We don't track where they go to.
So I think part of what we've heard as a district is, I think there's some really valuable considerations that have been brought forward about consideration of kind of the overall facilities of the district. And as some of you may know, there's a new TK that's being rolled out. And so not only are we looking at existing facilities and, you know, kind of the students that we've known over the years, but adding of an entire grade. And so there isn't an easy answer to that question, but I think what we heard, and also along with Mr. Gein's question about really kind of understanding the enrollment figures and the impact that charter schools have on our figures, I think are really critical. And so don't have a perfect answer for them tonight, but I think we can work as staff to bring some additional information to the next meeting so that hopefully we can provide some additional information about restricted facility funds and how we look at those kinds of deferred needs versus kind of more rebuilding, et cetera. And so I want to appreciate both of those questions. I don't think we have a great answer tonight, but we'd really like to bring some additional information forward to our next committee meeting.
Well, just a quick response to that is that, you know, one potential amazing use could be some sort of capital outlay for a facility that could be leased out to potential charter schools, and then one, you know, whatever term of that lease could be, and then eventually, you know, reused by the district at a certain point, or some sort of sharing thing where one's a charter. I mean, I don't know if they can have two schools on one site, but just all those kind of possibilities where land is such a premium where we are. And I think we're all focused on educational needs as a potential primary use for some of these facilities. I definitely like to get into some of the exchange thoughts that some of you more experienced folks may have in some other situations that have worked out for these type situations.
So that's a great, let me just wrap up Seaview, and then I wanted to kind of roll into that just from a thought perspective. We're at the end of our slides, but you know, looking at the properties, but did want to take a minute to address that. So on the Seaview site, again, the question is, you know, is this site surplus to district educational need? Talked a lot about that. A big part of that being the constraints that would be an impediment to doing something educationally on the property. And again, there's a process that you would, you know, deliberate on as a committee of, you know, okay, do we want to create a new source of income? And then how do we work with the county on this? And East Bay Regional Park District was at our first meeting, and they've expressed an interest in acquiring, you know, an extension of their Bay Trail. And, you know, and then the Contra Costa County, which owns the property just on the other side of parcel 2, where they've got some ball fields and things like that. So again, on the Naylor Act considerations, it does not appear, again, that the Naylor Act would apply if the recommendation was to surplus the property. But again, let me segue into you know, some of the things you've seen all the different pieces now of the 4 properties that we've been talking about. And, you know, from our understanding and the understanding of a lot of our clients that are school districts is that they need money, and the money, it can be used in a lot of different ways, whether it's for capital facilities, whether it's for maintenance, but it still requires money. So one of the things that we always try to encourage our school district clients to consider on properties that they do not have an educational need for now or in the future, but not without getting rid of the property, is creating a new source of revenue from that. What we found is that the exchange process, and Nancy alluded to that, but we've done over $300 million of exchanges with school district properties, in the process of doing more right now. You know, and what that does is, and the methodology is very simple. So the school district has a site, let's call it Seaview. And what we want to do is figure out from the development community if indeed the best way, what's the highest and best use, and what can we get in the marketplace for that. And that's going through an RP process that's paving the way to be able to maximize the value. With that, you enter into an agreement with the developer. Then what we would need to do then is find another piece of property that would create revenue, because right now the site, the Seaview site, or any of the sites are not creating revenue. They're actually costing the district money. They got to maintain it. They got to have liability insurance, all those things. So the goal would be, and I'm going to use this term in a generic way. So what you want to do is find an asset, a real estate asset that is basically a coupon clip. And when I say that, what I mean is that somebody is occupying that site. Let's call it a Taco Bell, because I always like Taco Bell and I'm actually hungry right now. So we'll call it a Taco Bell that is on a 25-year lease, and all they do is send the property owner a check every month. So that's a coupon clip. You don't have to maintain anything. You don't have to do anything. It's a credit tenant, all that stuff. So they send the district a check. So you enter into a deal where you acquire that Taco Bell or a CVS or whatever, and you use that then. So you have the district still has an asset. They got rid of an asset and they acquired another asset. They got rid of one of the properties, they acquired another property. This property happens to create revenue. And then from that, and Nancy said that there's some different things, and it's got to be structured correctly, but the revenue that comes off of that is all pretty much general fund money, which means that it can be spent and or leveraged to create other things, and that could be either to take care of ongoing maintenance. It could be leveraged in terms of a bond could be used, a COP or something like that could be used to leverage that up. So if you're getting $1 million, I can, use that source of revenue for capital purposes, and I can borrow $30 million and or whatever the number is. So I can do that and then use that source of revenue to be able to do things that are important for the district, whether it's capital expenditures, whether it's maintenance, whatever. So, and you still own the property. So that is why we like that methodology and why we like that and give that recommendation a lot, because it's really a great way for the district to preserve capital and to get revenue that's outside of state control. That means that the state can't come in and say, oh, we gave it to you this year, but we're not giving it to you next year. It's completely outside of that. So I'm hoping that's again, there's mechanics to all of that, but that's in essence what an exchange would do and why we like to recommend that. So Trey, does that answer your question?
Let me add just a bit to that to make it a real example, because Scott and I have actually, this is a real thing that happened. We work with a district that had 6 acres of dirt, probably worth $2 million an acre. So that's $12 million. We worked with the city where this property was to get it zoned from school, quasi-public, to residential. And a developer then was willing to pay the district, in the final analysis, $27 million for that piece of dirt, because it had the entitlements that he needed to build houses. We're not in the house building business as a school. We helped that district exchange it for an office building. So there were 3 partners. Partner 1 was the school district that owned the 6 acres of dirt. Partner 2 was the office building owner. And that building was producing, after all the management, about $1 million a year. And we were able to put a value on that building of about $22 million. We increased the 6 acres of dirt that the district owned to 27 million. So we exchanged those 2 pieces of property, and the district now owns a building that makes $1 million a year cash, and they got $5 million in cash to invest in maintenance and repairs for their district, whatever they chose to do with it. That's a real example that happened in 2020.
Well,
So it is doable.
And absolutely, that's what I sort of understood. I think you talked about that in a previous meeting.
I may have.
And the overall concept of the exchange is very clear. I'm trying to understand where the endpoint of this committee. So if we just said, let's exchange all the properties, for example, and that was our recommendation, because that seems to make incredible amount of sense, where there is no sort of red tape, if you will, that you have to get through, and you're getting a potential revenue stream starting quickly in the big picture of all this. And so where does that leave us? Like, what does the exchange process look like? As obviously there's valuations put on property, there's potential developers that come in, then there's the actual search process for the exchange property. I mean, it's just such an overwhelming thing to think about the timing and the process. I'm just not quite clear on the scope of how we get to that decision point within the limited information and time frame that we have in this committee.
So from the 7-Eleven process, what your charge is to make a recommendation. And you said part of that, I mean, again, the committee needs to deliberate on, what is it that we want to accomplish? Is this school site going to be used for educational purposes? If it can't, then what's our recommendation? And the recommendation can be, we would like the district to consider making these, via an exchange or ground lease or some other way where there's another property, or there's a way to create revenue from this property. And that can be used for district purposes, for capital improvements or whatever. So really, at the end of the day, it's actually pretty simple for the committee, is that, determining what is it the educational use, and if it's not, then what would you as a committee like the board to consider as for surplusing these properties, and what direction would you like them to go? That's a recommendation.
Okay.
Now, in terms of the timeline, that I'm going to tell, it depends. So nothing in the development world, like any other thing, happens overnight. So again, I tell our clients all the time that, wherever it is that you want to start this process, the time to get to the end is still the same. So how long do you want to wait before you start the process? And again, it's a sliding scale. So and again, there can be some imperative stuff that the board can recommend. That, I don't know why I keep calling you a board. Committee can recommend that the states, we would like the board to surplus these properties, but to not sell them, but to exchange them, to create new revenue sources as soon as possible. I mean, it has to be fairly generic. So that could be a recommendation.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Now, the other thing is that I want to respect everybody's time, and we've just gone past our 8 o'clock time. So we're on time and a half, Lewis and Melissa.
With your presentation, so I think it's back to the agenda and next steps.
Well, we have Ms. Torres, so we want to make sure she gets her chance.
Thank you. Yes, this is probably going to open up a whole can of worms, and so we can probably discuss this at our next meeting. Something to chew on, I guess, before our next meeting. I know we've discussed exchanges, we've discussed leases. I would like to hear more about workforce housing. I know that was mentioned as a possibility earlier. So I'd like to hear more about this and what potential there is for, I don't know, just basically how all of that could work. It doesn't have to be tonight, because I know I'm exhausted and I already kind of overwhelmed with a lot of information. But I do want to put it out there that making a lot of money isn't always in the best interests of our educational community. We also have to think about, me as a mother with young children in the school district. I'm also thinking about, in my daughter's school, they can't find teachers. And a big part of that is because, as mentioned earlier, the cost of living is really expensive in the Bay Area. So if I'm thinking about, sustaining the quality of education in our school district, housing is something I don't want to, I want to give that full consideration as a possibility for some of these sites if possible.
and again, there's going to be constraints on all of those. So, the workforce housing is important. Let me tell you, one of the things that we just did and just entered into with another school district this week, when all the documents were signed actually today. And what we're doing is we're exchanging one of the school district's properties, it's 3.5 acre piece of property. And what we were able to do is get a for-profit affordable housing developer to acquire the property. And he is going to build homes on, or apartments on that are going to be in the 30 to 80% AMI, and that's average median income for, and every area is different. So that's what they're going to do. The one thing that I will tell you is that the last thing that any public agency really wants to get into is owning apartments, owning housing. What you want to do is look at, or one of the things to consider is looking at acquiring something like that or having somebody else build it, but you don't want to be in the management business. And I'm saying that from the school district perspective, because they're just not set up to do that. They just aren't. So every one of them, I got way too many examples of districts that have tried to do that, have not done it. The ones that have pretty much failed, and they're very expensive. So I can expand more on that, Samantha, later, and I think that's something that's important. But if you also look at the sites that we have, the 4 sites, none of them really lend themselves to anything other than, like not affordable housing. There's really none of them that do that. I mean, Seaview, you're probably limited at single family homes. Adams, you've got a lot of issues there. You're not going to be able to build high density because of the Alquist Priola. Same thing with Portola. You could do higher density or that kind of workforce housing on the Harmon Knolls site. That's fairly level. That's fairly, and actually the CCNR says that if you are going to do something with it, it should be higher density housing or apartment type housing. So doing something, I want you to look at that with that lens, but then also look at it, if we take these properties and create revenue and create income off of that, then we can maybe acquire other housing that does that and it accomplishes that. Does that make sense what I just said?
Sure. And I would like to hear more about this at the next meeting, but I would also like to see examples, or at least have examples that we can maybe research on our own of school districts that have attempted to utilize the workforce housing.
We can share that at the next meeting. And being a former school superintendent, there are definitely pros and cons of how to go about that. The need you identified is real, but there are many different options to get there, whether it's subsidies for rent or self-help purchasing. There's a lot of things that go into it, but I support Scott 100%. You do not want to get into the housing business as a school district. You will lose money and you're taking your staff away from their primary mission.
Well, thank you, everyone. As we've hit kind of 8:13, we have our long-standing pending action item, but I think I know the committee may be okay with moving that to the next meeting as we've done. Maybe we'll put that at the beginning of next meeting. One of the things that we'd like to really gear up for at our next meeting, which we're planning for November 3rd, is bringing kind of the skeletal framework of what a draft report would look like and really diving into committee recommendations for the different properties. And so hopefully tonight you had an opportunity to hear really what the different types of options are within the corners of the law, and kind of a refresher on the properties. And so we also heard there's a couple of items that you'd like to learn a little bit more about in terms of enrollment, the broader kind of facility needs across the districts, and then workforce housing. And so we'll work on putting some of that information together. And then we'll be reaching out to make sure that everyone can attend. We have some comments that were shared in the chat just from a community lens that I'd like to just share really quickly. Says a few thoughts. I think community involvement and thoughts would be critical for any site decisions, and would like to suggest that the next meeting dates are sent out to the whole community so they're aware. As West Contra Costa is seriously strapped for cash, creating long-term sustainable revenue streams, whether through exchange or some form of capital build and or leases, crucial. None of the border admins will be around in 10 years, but the needs of the West Contra Costa families will be ever present. If we sell a property outright, the district will never be able to buy land back. And I also see kind of in closing comments, Ms. Torres, your hand's raised.
There you go.
Okay. So with that, I'll ask, I guess we typically ask if the committee would like to table the last action item for the next meeting. Maybe I could just do a quick roll vote for that. Do I have a motion?
What's the last item on the agenda?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not presenting it. It's the election of the 7-Eleven committee officers.
Do we even have a quorum?
Yes,
We
Oh,
do.
okay.
So we have in attendance 5 of the 8 members, but it is 8:15. So we could also move it to the beginning of the next meeting agenda.
Move we table it.
I move we table it.
Okay, do I have a second?
Sure.
Second.
Yes, I'll second.
2 moves in 2 seconds. So I'll do a quick roll call. Thank you so much. Mr. Sanders,
yes,
Collins,
Yes,
Ms. Torres,
Yes.
Ms. Sigler,
Yes.
and Mr. Gosney.
Sure.
All right, terrific.
And do we have another date?
Yes, so our next committee meeting is planned for November 3rd. Our team member will be reaching out to everyone to ensure that they're able to attend the meeting. Want to thank everyone again for taking the time to join us tonight and staying a little later. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Have a great night.
Have a great night. Thank you very much.
thank you.